Ever find yourself in a sticky situation, wondering, is this where I get to shout self-defense?
Well, today's the day we find out.
We're really diving deep into unlawful aggression today,
Unlawful aggression, yeah.
which is like the core of self-defense law in the Philippines, right?
Absolutely, it's a big one.
And we're digging into this binder1.pdf thing,
Okay.
which seems like it's like some kind of law textbook or something.
Right, right.
So hopefully we can make sense of it all.
Yeah, should be interesting. You know, it's fascinating because with self-defense, it's not just about whether someone actually did something.
Right.
It's also about whether they were justified in doing it.
So even if you threw a punch, there might be a good reason why you threw that punch.
Exactly. The law actually lays out these legal defenses, and self-defense is a big one in the Philippines. But here's the thing. You can't just say it was self-defense. You've got to be ready to prove it.
So it's not enough to just say, well, the other side didn't prove I wasn't defending myself. You have to have your own case.
Exactly. You need your own evidence. And to build that case, there are 3 things you have to prove.
Okay.
1, there was a real and immediate threat.
Yeah. Wow.
2, that you reacted in a justifiable way. And 3, that you didn't start the fight. You didn't provoke it.
Oh, okay. So you can't be the instigator and then be like self-defense.
Exactly. Exactly.
So well, let's break those down. Let's start with the first one. That immediate threat idea. That sounds intense.
It is. We're talking about genuine danger, like actual harm, not just someone shouting threats.
So if someone's just yelling in your face, that's not enough.
Not on its own, no. Our textbook, it actually gives some clear examples of what would count.
Okay.
Things like someone pulling a gun on you, or someone lunging with a knife, or actually being physically trapped and attacked.
Okay.
Those are signs of real danger.
Got it. So what about, like, a light shove?
Right.
Or the book even mentions this funny example of like a foot kick greeting.
Yeah.
Apparently, playfully kicking someone's foot is not a threat under the law.
Right. There has to be a line somewhere. A shove or a playful kick, those might be annoying.
Sure.
But they're not the same as someone actually trying to cause you serious harm.
It's about context.
Context is key.
Okay. So, context matters. Let's talk about some of those situations where the line gets a little blurry. The textbook mentions some cases that really highlight that.
Oh, yeah. These cases are where it gets interesting. For example, let's say someone's caught cheating, right? And the person they cheated on gets angry and attacks them.
Oh, wow.
The law actually says that the angry person's anger is justified in that situation.
Really?
So the cheater can't then claim self-defense.
Wow. So even if the person who cheated felt threatened, the law sees what the spouse did differently because of the circumstances.
Exactly. It's really nuanced like that. Another case highlights how you can't just react based on, like, appearances alone.
Okay.
So just because you see someone pull something out of their jacket,
Right.
that doesn't automatically mean you can attack them.
It's not about what they do owe. It's about what you think is about to happen.
Exactly. You have to genuinely believe that they're about to hurt you.
You can't just jump the gun, so to speak.
Right. And this is important, retaliation. Totally different from self-defense.
Okay.
If the initial threat is over, you can't keep attacking and call it self-defense.
So it's really about protecting yourself in the moment.
Yes.
Not getting even after the moment has passed.
Exactly. Now let's get to that second element. Making sure your actions were actually justified in the face of a threat.
Right. So if someone, like, shoves you, you can't just pull out a sword and be like, self-defense.
Right. You can't just use any weapon you want.
Right.
It's about using an appropriate level of force for the situation.
No cannons for swatting flies.
It's last.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The law actually uses the phrase to prevent and to repel.
Okay.
That suggests it's not just about reacting once the attack is happening. It's about preventing a threat, too.
So if someone's, like, coming at you with a weapon or something, you don't have to wait until they're actually, like, touching you to defend yourself.
Exactly. The law understands that in a life or death situation, you don't have time to plan your every move. It has to be instinctual.
Trust your gut.
Right.
And it sounds like the place and occasion of the threat matters too. Like the text even says that being threatened in a dark, isolated alley might mean a different response is justified than if you were in like a crowded restaurant.
Absolutely. You're more vulnerable in a secluded area. There was actually this case in Spain. This guy was startled by his friend.
Who was pretending to rob him in a dark place.
Oh, no.
And the court actually said that his reaction, which was to shoot his friend, Justified.
Wow.
Because in that moment of perceived danger, he couldn't be expected to rationally process everything.
Wow. So even if you're mistaken, if it's reasonable under the circumstances, it can still be a valid defense. But what about situations where, like, it's not a super clear-cut physical threat?
Right.
Like, how does the law handle that?
Yeah, that's where it gets tricky. This book makes it pretty clear. You've got to genuinely need to defend yourself. It can't just be an overreaction.
Right. So you can't, like, chase down an attacker who's already running away and be like, self-defense.
Right.
If you hurt them in the process.
Exactly. Or, like, continuing to stab someone after they've been disarmed. Or shooting at someone when it's obvious they weren't a threat anymore. Those wouldn't fly.
It's like the law is saying, okay, you need to be sure there's a real danger.
Yeah.
But then you also need to, like, react in a way that makes sense. You can't go totally overboard the second you feel a little bit threatened. Yeah. And speaking of reacting in a way that makes sense, what about, like, the actual weapon you use to defend yourself? Does that factor into all of this?
Definitely. The law calls it the means employed to fend off an attack.
Okay.
And it's not about perfectly matching what the attacker has, like, oh, they have a knife, I better get my knife. It's more about using a level of force that's, you know, reasonable given everything else that's going on.
So, like, are there situations where using a gun against someone with a knife would be justifiable?
Absolutely. The book actually mentions a bunch of situations where using a firearm against a knife or even a bolo was totally reasonable. But it also points out that, like, using a bayonet to stab someone multiple times after they've already been disarmed, that's way too far.
So it always comes back to proportionality, right?
Yes.
Meeting the threat with an equal level of force,
Exactly.
but not going beyond what's necessary in that moment. Okay, so what about those situations where, like, there's a big difference in physical strength? Say, if someone much smaller is being attacked by someone much larger.
Yeah, that's a huge factor. The law gets that a weaker person might need to use a weapon to defend themselves, even if the attacker isn't armed.
Oh, interesting.
Especially if there's a big power imbalance. This book actually talks about one case where a man was cornered and being beaten up by, like, a group of larger guys.
Oh, wow.
And the court said he was totally justified in using a knife to protect himself because he was outnumbered and outmatched.
It's almost like the law is trying to, like, level the playing field a little bit in those situations.
Right.
Recognizing that a smaller person might need something more.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just size, too. The attacker's personality, their history, can also be a factor.
Oh, really?
If they're known to be violent or have history of assault.
Right.
That changes things. There's even a case in here where a smaller guy with a bolo was justified in using lethal force against a larger bully who just kept attacking him, even after being warned to stop because of his reputation for violence.
So it's not just about the immediate situation. It's like the history of the people involved.
Exactly.
Adds a whole other layer, doesn't it? This is making me think about, like, situations with law enforcement officers, too.
Oh, yeah.
Because they're in these situations all the time. So how does this idea of reasonable force apply to them?
Well, that's a great question. Because their job puts them in such unique situations, you know? They have this duty to enforce the law.
Right.
But they're also bound by really strict rules when it comes to using force.
So they can't just go around doing whatever they want.
Right, exactly. The book actually makes the point that an officer can't just run away from a dangerous situation.
Right. They kind of have to hold their ground.
Right.
In a way that a civilian might be able to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean they have a free pass to use excessive force.
Right, right.
It has to be proportionate to the threat and the circumstances.
Okay.
There's this case in here where an officer with a revolver and a club shot an attacker who had a knife. And the court said that was justified. Because one, an officer's club isn't always effective against a knife.
Right.
And two, they're not obligated to try and have a fair fight with an assailant.
Right. Yeah, it's about protecting themselves, but yeah, they still have to operate within the law.
Exactly.
What about when an officer's, like, trying to apprehend a suspect?
Well, there was this one case where an officer actually shot at a fleeing detainee after firing warning shots.
Oh.
And that was considered justified because the officer genuinely believed that the detainee would escape otherwise.
So even in those high-pressure situations, those split-second decisions are still, like, judged based on the information that they had at the time.
Exactly.
And I guess that's what makes it so tricky, right?
Right.
Because it's not always clear-cut.
It's not black and white, yeah.
What's fascinating to me is how these legal concepts can seem so abstract sometimes.
Right.
But then you look at some of these real-world examples.
Yeah.
And it really shows how nuanced these judgments can be. Like there's this one example in here about a security guard who shot and killed a fleeing thief.
Right.
And the court decided that was too much force.
Interesting.
Because even though the guy was a thief, he wasn't an immediate threat to the guard's life in that moment.
Right.
So even when someone's doing their job,
right.
the law recognizes that taking a life has to be an absolute last resort.
Exactly. And that actually brings up another point from the text, the concept of avoidance of greater evil or injury.
Okay.
This defense basically says it's okay to cause some harm if it prevents something even worse from happening.
Oh, yeah. Like I've heard of that. It's like that classic example of when there's a huge fire and they have to like demolish some buildings to create a fire break and stop it from spreading.
Exactly.
It's tragic, but it's ultimately preventing even more damage.
Exactly. And the book actually gives this really interesting case about this truck carrying gasoline.
Oh, wow.
And the truck catches fire.
Oh, no.
And to stop it from reaching this nearby gas station.
Oh, my gosh, yeah.
And potentially causing a massive explosion.
Right.
The driver decides to steer away, but it meant crashing into a house. Well, the court actually said that the homeowner had the right to sue the gas station owner for the damage to their property.
Wow.
Even though the driver was trying to prevent, like, a way bigger disaster from happening.
That's wild. So even if you have good intentions when you're making these crazy judgment calls under pressure, you could still be held responsible if the court feels like there might have been other options.
Precisely. The law wants to see that you at least considered all the alternatives.
Right.
Before you did something that caused harm, even if you were trying to prevent something worse.
So we were talking about those gray areas where someone might be acting to protect themselves, but it gets kind of murky.
Right, right.
Like what about when someone's doing something that would be wrong?
Okay.
But they're doing it because it's actually part of their job.
Yeah.
Right. The classic example is always a police officer making an arrest.
Right, right.
They might have to use some level of force, and that force might hurt someone.
Yeah.
But they were just doing what they were supposed to do.
Right. That's where those justifying circumstances we talked about earlier really come into play.
Okay.
Because the law gets that there are times when someone, like a law enforcement officer or even just a regular person might have to do something that, under normal circumstances would be considered a crime.
Totally. So there is some legal protection there because they're acting in their professional capacity.
Yeah, there's a certain amount, but it's not like a get-out-of-jail-free card, right?
Right.
Like, they can't just use totally unnecessary force and then be like, well, I was on the clock, so...
Oh, I'm a cop. Right, right.
Exactly. The book actually really stresses that they have to be acting lawfully, like within the bounds of their job.
Okay.
And, if something happens because of their actions, it has to be like a direct result of what they were supposed to be doing, not just them going rogue.
Got it. So, like, you can't be, like, off duty and then decide to arrest someone.
Right, exactly.
You're like, well, technically, I'm a police officer.
Yeah, you can't just decide to take the law into your own hands.
Yeah.
There's actually a really good example in here about a policeman who shot and killed an escaped prisoner.
Okay.
And the prisoner had refused to surrender, and he was armed. But what's interesting is that he was armed with a sharpened piece of bamboo.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So, you could argue that's not as dangerous as a gun or a knife.
Right.
But the court still ruled that the shooting was justified because the officer was acting in his capacity to try and apprehend this escaped convict.
That makes sense. Like, that was his job to get this guy back into custody.
Exactly.
But I'm wondering, what if the prisoner hadn't been armed?
Right.
What if he was just, like, surrendering?
Then it would be a whole different story, right?
Right.
It all comes back to the same elements. The threat has to be real.
Right.
The response has to be proportionate.
Yep.
And you can't use more force than is necessary in that situation.
So it's really a judgment call in a lot of these situations.
It is, and that's why, training is so important for law enforcement.
Right.
Because they need to be able to make those split-second decisions.
Right.
And understand the nuances of the law.
Because even though they are given a certain amount of authority,
right,
it's not unlimited?
Absolutely not. There are limits, and the law is very clear about that. And Biner1.pdf gives examples of other cases, too.
Right.
Like times when officers were in the right to use force to, stop a crime from happening or to arrest a suspect who is resisting.
You sure?
But they emphasize over and over that whatever they do, it has to be reasonable. It has to be necessary.
Right. Right. So it's a tough balance to strike.
It is. It's a tough balance. It's not always easy to know what the right answer is.
Totally. Yeah. Now, I'm curious about one more thing. What about if you're, say, in the military and you're given an order by a superior officer,
Okay.
but that order ends up with you doing something that's, like, unlawful?
Oh, that's a tricky one.
Right. Like, where does the responsibility lie there?
That's a really good question, and it's something that, legal scholars have debated for a long time.
Right.
The general rule is that you're only off the hook for following an order if that order was lawful to begin with.
Okay, so if the order itself was bogus,
Right. If the order itself was messed up.
then you're still on the hook, even if you were just, like, following directions.
Exactly. And this is where it gets tough because, you're trained to follow orders,
Right.
but the law is also saying, hey, you can't just blindly do whatever you're told, especially if you kind of have a hunch that it's wrong.
Right.
Like you have a responsibility to speak up or to question it.
That's a tough position to be in, though.
It is, and that's why this area of law is so complicated. There's a really intense example in the text about a soldier who was ordered by his sergeant to torture and kill someone. Oh, wow.
And, he followed the order.
Right.
And the court actually found him guilty of murder because the order itself was illegal.
Wow. So even though he was following what he was told to do, the court was like, nope, you should have known better.
Exactly. And it comes down to, like, did the person know or should they have known that what they were doing was messed up?
So it's not just about blindly following orders. It's about using your own judgment, too.
Exactly. And that's a tough thing to do, especially in those high-pressure situations, right?
Right.
But the law expects a certain level of, like, moral judgment, I guess.
Right. Okay. Well, this has been such a fascinating deep dive.
It really
I
had.
feel like we've really gone deep into this idea of self-defense.
We've covered so much ground.
Yeah.
We've looked at the real nitty-gritty of the law. Like, what does it actually mean to act in self-defense?
Right.
When can you use force? How much force is too much?
And all those gray areas in between.
And all the gray area. And then we've talked about these real-world situations.
Real-life examples.
Where things get even more complicated, like with law enforcement.
Right. Where the stakes are even higher.
Exactly. And it really shows just how much, like, nuance and interpretation goes into these decisions.
Yeah, it's not always easy to know what's right and wrong.
Right. It's not just black and white.
Definitely not.
Like, we like to think about the law as being very cut and dry.
Yeah, very straightforward.
But, as we've seen,
lots of gray areas.
There are so many gray areas.
It's more about principles than, like, hard and fast rules sometimes.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes this so fascinating, is that, it's not enough to just know what the law says.
Right.
You have to understand, like, the context.
The why behind it.
The thinking behind it.
The intent.
And be able to apply it to these really messy real-life situations.
And that's what makes it so important to talk about, right?
Totally. Totally.
Because, like we've been saying, this stuff comes up all the time.
In the news, in our own lives, potentially.
Obviously. So, being informed.
Being aware of your rights.
Knowing what the law actually says and what it doesn't say.
Because I think a lot of times we make assumptions about what we think the law is.
Right. We have these ideas in our heads.
But until you actually dig into it.
It's not always that simple.
It's not always that simple. So on that note, this has been a fantastic deep dive into unlawful aggression.
It really has.
And all of its complexities. We hope you learned something new today, and maybe, just maybe, this is giving you something to think about the next time you hear about a case of self-defense in the news, or even if you ever find yourself in a situation where you need to protect yourself. Until next time, stay safe and stay informed.